A long time ago in the mountains, it was winter. And it had always been winter. And more than that, it was dark. And it had always been dark. And all the animals just went around feeling their way and crashing into each other. But one day, well, there was no day yet, but one time, it began to get even darker, if possible, and even colder. And all the animals began to shiver and to shake and to huddle together. And they crowded in and they started asking each other what had happened, and no one knew. And so they didn't know what to do about it. And then they started talking among each other, and they said, "Oh, who's here?" And they started listing off Mouse and Badger, Rabbit, and they realized Bear wasn't there. They said, "Where's Bear?" And the birds crept out a little further and flew, trying not to crash into trees. And they were calling, "Bear, Bear!" And finally Bear came up. And Bear had this huge coat. Long tail. They said, "Bear, why aren't you huddled with us?" And Bear said, "Well, I'm quite warm." They said, "Warm? What is that?" And Mouse crept up and said, "Oh, it's very nice." And they said, "How are you so warm, Bear?" He said, "Well, I have this coat." They said, "Well, can we have some?" He said, "Well, I'll just give you a little bit off my tail." And he cut little pieces from his tail and made little bear coats for all the animals. And there were so many of them that all that was left of Bear's luxurious tail was this little tiny tail. And that's why to this day, Bear has a small tail. But all the animals now, they were there and they were bundled up. They looked like tiny little bears, and they went around and they were warm, but they still couldn't see, and they crashed into each other. "Oh, who's that? Oh, it's Skunk. Oh, hi, Skunk. Oh, who's that? Oh, Porcupine." And they went around and they said, this isn't pleasant, because before they could just make out forms, and now they couldn't see anything, and it continued to get even colder. And even in their bear coats, they were all starting to shake and huddle together. And they realized that they couldn't continue this way. And so they decided they were going to have to look out over the land and see if it was different anywhere. And so the birds went out and they searched, and no one saw anything. And finally, they were all waiting. An eagle came back from high above and came down. He said, "I have seen something." And they said, "Seen?" He said, "Yes. In the distance, there was a glow. And when I got closer, I could make out forms and shapes. I didn't have to feel my way. And there was a village. And coming from the village, there was heat." They're like, "Heat?" He said, "Yes, that's what's missing. Heat." And so I went closer and I saw that the heat was coming. I felt it was coming from this glowing substance. It was in a basket at the top of a pole in the center of this village. And they said, "That's marvelous." He said, "Yes, as I got closer, I could hear them speaking, and they called it fire." They said, "Well, do you think they'd give us some?" He said, "Well, that's the thing. This fire is kept at the top of the pole in this village so that no one can get to it. And the village is filled with giants, all of whom are carrying enormous clubs. And they run out and they attack anyone who gets close. They threw their clubs at me. I had to fly away as fast as possible." And all the animals said, "That doesn't sound so great. What can be done? Someone has to go." And no one wanted to go. And finally, a voice said, "I'll go." And I said, "Who's there?" I said, "Oh, it's Possum." So, okay, Possum, what you go. And so Possum set off. And at first a few animals walked with her, but they got too nervous, so they turned back. And Possum kept going. And she walked and she walked, and as she was walking, it did begin to get warmer. And she took off her bear coat, and she walked, and she was just in her own beautiful silvery fur. And Possum at that point had a beautiful silvery fluffy tail to rival foxes. And she walked, and she began to be able to see, and then it began to get really warm. And it was great. But she had a mission, so she kept going. And she went in, and she got to the edge of that village, and there were the giants with their clubs, and there was the pole. And she crept closer and closer. She was so stealthy. She crept in and she climbed that pole, because she was a good climber. And she went right up to the top. And ooh, it was hot. But there was a stick sticking out, and she grabbed it, pulled it out, and had an ember on the end. But she needed somewhere to put it to conceal the light. So she took it and she stuffed it in her tail. And she climbed down. But as she began to climb, a trail of smoke began to come out of her tail. And she just made the smallest little squeaking noise. And with that, all the giants froze. And they turned and they looked and they saw this little being coming down the pole. And she saw that and she climbed faster, and they grabbed their clubs. And she got to the ground and she started to run. And they were coming after her, and she ran and she ran. And I don't know if you've ever blown a tinder bundle into flame, but if you put a coal in something fluffy and give it air, eventually it stops being a coal and bursts into flame. And Possum was going so fast. They started throwing the clubs. She was dodging and weaving, and she was going so fast that her tail began to smoke more and more, and poof, her tail was on fire, and she was running now as fast as she could. And she ran out of that village, and there was a lake. And she ran up, and her tail was burning up, and she dove into the lake. And the fire went out. And Possum swam across the lake. The giants stopped following. You could see the fire had gone out, and she climbed out the other side, and she limped her way home. She found her bear's coat and put it on, and by the time she got back, she was shaking so hard that she could barely say anything. And finally, she ran in to Mole. I said, "Who's there?" I said, "It's Possum." "Possum, you're back." I said, everyone, Possum's back." Possum said, no, it's not good news. And I said, "Well, tell us what happened." And she told them the whole story. And they said, "So you really didn't bring it?" She said, "No, and look at my tail." And all that beautiful, fluffy fur had burned off of Possum's tail. And to this day, possums don't have any fur on their tails. And the animal said, "Oh, that's terrible. That's terrible." "Well, but tell us about the fire." And she told them about how warm it was, and she told how light it was, and how for a moment it was glorious with the heat. And they all sat there and they listened, and finally Vulture said, I'll go. Someone's got to. I can fly in. Just grab it, no problem." And so Vulture set off with his powerful wings, and he went way high up, so high above the village that he was just a speck, and none of the giants looked up. And there he was. He circled slowly down. But as he got closer, as he continued to spiral, they looked up and they saw, and they're all pointing, and they're getting ready, and they're getting rocks and sticks to throw. And he realizes he's going to have to be fast. And he swoops down and he grabs a coal, and ooh, it's hot on his feet, and he tucks it into the feathers of his neck. And Vulture at this time also had beautiful feathers all around his head. So he just tucked it right in there, and he took off, flying, and the stones are coming at him, the clubs, everything, and he's just flying as fast as he can. And he flies and he gets out and he gets over that lake, and he's just going and going, but that trickle of smoke is coming out. It's going down the back, and it's getting bigger and bigger, and then his head burst into flame. And he can't see where he's going. There's fire, there's smoke, he can't breathe. And he's flying around like crazy. And he loses his way. And he peers out through the smoke and he sees he's going back to the village. It's getting lighter. And he looks down and there's that lake. And he remembers Possum's story and he dives straight into the lake and puts out his head. Well, he gets himself out. And he's bedraggled and he's trying to walk. He doesn't get very far. He has to stand there with his wings out. I don't know if you've ever seen a vulture do this on hot days after a storm up in the trees. You can watch the vulture steam, and he just stands there and steams. And he thinks about going back. And he can feel his head. It feels blistered and raw. And he's worn out. So he goes back. He flies back. And he comes down. I said, "Who's there?" "It's Vulture. Vulture! Everyone, it's Vulture. Come quick." He says, I can't tell you. No good news. No good news. I can't tell you good news. I said, "Well, tell us what happened." And he told the whole story. And they looked at his head, and it was red and raw looking. To this day, Turkey Vulture has no feathers on his head. He said, it can't be done. We can't go by land. We can't go by air. There's nothing. And all the animals are just kind of like, "Oh, I guess so." Well, there was one being who'd been listening the whole time. And she was one who always liked to think long about things. And she decided she would go down to the river and have a walk. And she went down, and as she was walking along the river, she felt the cool mud under her feet. And she began to get an idea. And she felt the cool mud clumping against her feet. And she began to pick it up and to roll it into a ball. And this was Grandmother Spider. She'd been around a long time. And she began to play with that clay. And she began to mold it. And before you knew it, she'd made a pot with a lid. And she roped it up and put it on her back. And she set off. She didn't tell anyone she was going. She just went. And there she was. If you've ever seen a spider walking, carrying an egg sack on its back, that's just what she looked like. Little spider with her little sack, a little clay pot on her back. And this, I should say, was the first pot anyone had ever made. And she carried it along, and she was so small that when she got to the edge of that village, she just walked in and no one noticed. And she climbed up that pole, and she got to the top, and she didn't take a stick. She waited. And throughout the day, the fire died down a bit. And soon it was embers. All the giants were going to bed. And she reached in then, very carefully, and with the lid of the pot, knocked the tiniest ember into her pot. And she put on the lid, put it back on her back, and crept down the pole. And she crept out of the village, and she walked all the way back. It took her a long time, and no one knew she was even gone. And finally, she crept back to where the animals were, and she called out, and no one heard her. So she went until she found Mouse. And she said, "Mouse! Mouse! I have something to tell you." Mouse said, oh, who is it? "Oh, hello, Spider. What do you have to tell me?" She said, I've brought back fire." "What's that?" fire, Mouse! I've brought back fire. Here, look. And she opened the lid a tiny bit, and this little light, a little glow came out. And Mouse said, "Oh, fire!" and ran around and told everyone. And soon all the animals were there. They said, "You've brought fire?" And she's like, "Yes, but it's very little. We need to grow it. I have the tiniest piece. How should..." And everyone said, "Well, how should we do it?" And she said, "Well, I saw while I was up that pole, the giants would feed the fire, and they would feed it wood." I said, "Well, we can get wood." And Moose ran off and came back with a log in his antlers and threw it down and said, "There, feed that to the fire." She said, "I think it's very small. We have to grow it. It's like an egg." And the bird said, "Oh, like an egg. Let's make it a nest." And the birds went out and they brought back the tiniest things, the fluffiest things. And the mice said, "We make nests too." And they went out and they brought back the fluffy things. And the squirrels, they brought back what they made nests from, the sticks and the leaves. And soon all the animals were out there and they were gathering sticks and branches, and they brought them back and they made a little nest. And around that nest, they made a slightly bigger nest and a bigger nest. And soon they had this immense teepee made of trees on the outside, brought back by Moose and Bear. And in the middle, that tiny little bird's nest. And Spider walked in and she opened the lid and she just tipped the ember in. And then Possum said, "Wait, I remember. When I was running, it was just a little smoke at first, like that. But as the wind caught my tail, the smoke came out more, and the birds came forward and they began to fan that nest with their wings. And the smoke came out a little bit more and a little bit more, and the bigger birds came, and suddenly it burst into flame. And that teepee was so well made that the flames quickly went up through all the layers. And on the outside were those huge trees, and the flames shot up. And they shot up with such force that a huge ball of fire went flying up into the sky. And it just went up and up and up and became the sun. And from all the little bits of hemlock and pine in that fire shot sparks, and they shot up all the way, and they became the stars. And from that day forward, there was day and there was night, and there was winter and there was summer, and there was heat and there was light, and there were stars at night, and there was fire. And all the animals could take off their bear cloaks, and they could see, and the plants began to grow again. And there were pots for cooking and for carrying. And all of that was thanks to Spider. And that is all I know. Thanks for listening tonight. I'll see you next week.